everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Before I jump into the books for today's video, I did want to say a quick thank you to a couple of very supportive viewers from my last few videos. So thank you so much to Judge Caldwell as well as my friend Anand for leaving comments on the last video. It really means a lot and keeps me motivated. So today I want to talk about two books that I think fit into an overall fantasy / sci-fi and mystery genre. And I also have a couple of special guests in the background. That's David Meowie and Paula Abdul, who are my friends' cats that I'm cat sitting. So maybe I'll give a little bit of a summary without spoilers, I hope, of each book, and then I'll let you know my thoughts. So the first book I want to talk about is The Surrogate Protocol by Tom Chang-e, and then I'm also going to be discussing The Flesh Hunters by Jocelyn Suarez. So Surrogate Protocol came out in 2017, and The Flesh Hunters is a little bit more recent. It's from 2021. So if we start off with Surrogate Protocol, this follows one main character. His name is Landon Locke, and it takes place in Singapore, but kind of the Singapore of the future. But the very first sentence of the book sets the scene as being in Singapore. It goes, "Singapore isn't sterile like everyone says. It's full of secrets. Take me, for instance. I'm an anomaly, and I think the world ought to know this. But I don't know if it's a good thing, because if the world found out, I'd probably be cut open." So that's kind of the very ominous introduction to Landon as a character. And essentially you find out as you continue through the book that he lives forever, he's immortal, and he needs to find a way to invent identities for himself so he doesn't get caught up in the system and discovered as someone who doesn't die. On top of that, he has memory issues, so you kind of find out things in a very blurred and uncertain way because our main protagonist and the narrator is unable to remember much about his life or his previous identities. So what he does is he journals, and he has a huge collection of diaries where he's had different names and different identities, and that's his way of remembering his past and his past lives. So in the present day, he works as a barista. Over his different identities and lives, he's always loved coffee and been able to make good coffee, so that's kind of how he sustains himself. And the plot is basically him trying to uncover who he is, why he can live forever, are there other people like him, and then there are also mysterious characters from his past who he can't really pin down who they are, and there's also present day characters who are either trying to tail him or catch him or murder him. And we do know that there's a mysterious organization called Codex that's trying to track him down. So that's kind of the overall plot of this book. Is he is kind of like a stand-in for the audience, so the both of us are trying to figure out what's going on and why these people are after him. I think that what I did like about this book is the characterization of Landon. I do feel like I had some sort of affinity towards him, and because the focus was on him for most of the book, I felt quite close to him, and I feel like I was really going on this journey along with him. On the flip side, I found it really annoying that he couldn't remember anything. And I think on one level, it was just frustrating as a reader. And on another level, it almost seemed kind of tricky. Like, I felt like it was a bit gimmicky almost for the author to employ that as his main plot device, because then it just feels like an easy crutch. You know, if he could remember things, then this book wouldn't exist. And maybe if on top of that there had been more in-depth musings or meditations around identity and memory and whether, you know, reality only exists if we remember it, then it might have been more justified. But this was a lighter read and was more action-packed and kind of more of a mystery structure. So we didn't really get a lot of that, and it ended up being a little bit confusing and a little bit frustrating because the main character really can't remember much. So because Landon has lived all these lives over different periods of history within Singapore. We do get to witness some different scenes, including what Landon is up to and some scenes that happened during World War II, as well as under Japanese occupation. Landon also personally experiences the Bukit Ho Swee fire, which is a very infamous or famous fire in Singapore's history because it happened in a village area and was kind of used as the justification for moving Singaporean citizens from kampongs or villages into the middle of the city, to the city center, into public housing, because the argument was that everything was so close together and it was easy to catch on fire and it was a devastating fire. So it was nice to have kind of these different scenes happen and make a nod to various parts of Singapore's history. But I don't think it really added like a ton. It was just kind of nice to have these different glimpses of Singapore through Landon's eyes. But in general, I feel like the plot and the mystery didn't hook me too much. It wasn't that gripping. And then I also feel that the author could have done a lot more with this idea of a surrogate protocol. It's kind of explained why that's important. And there are some like big reveals about Landon's backstory and his origin story, but I kind of just glossed over them. I don't know if they were the most satisfying to read. So for this book, I actually gave it 2 stars on Goodreads. And I also did mention in my review on Goodreads that the writing is a bit clunky, but the author does a good job of embodying the protagonist. So I did feel that. I felt like this is a very fully fleshed out and realized character that the author spent a lot of time on and a lot of time with, I guess. And the sci-fi elements were passable, the plot was passable, but not super compelling, maybe because I was not invested in any of the other characters, and the main character had so many memory problems that it was kind of hard to follow what he could remember and what he knew about his own multiple lives. So I do feel like there should have been more of a driving theme or a driving motivation for Landon, or a point that the author was trying to get across. Okay, so the second book that I want to talk about that is also a bit sci-fi and mystery genre is The Flesh Hunters, and I like this a bit more, I think, because the plot was easier to hook into. I think the writing was nothing fancy, a little bit simplistic actually, but I think the combination of the plot and the mystery along with kind of this sparse world building was pretty successful. This book also takes place in kind of an imagined Singapore. So if you had watched my other video on The Gatekeeper by Nuralia Nurasid, she has an imagined Singapore-esque country called Manticura. And then in this, The Flesh Hunters, we have an imagined Singapore-esque country called Haitan. So this book definitely incorporates more elements of East Asian terminology or jargon or cultures, not just Singapore. So Haitan, I feel like, could be Chinese or Japanese. There's actually a lot of Japanese names in the book. But if you look at the map, like, it's obviously Singapore, but it's actually called Osho. So whereas Surrogate Protocol is actually in Singapore and has Singaporean historical events, this is more fantasy mystery. It's kind of almost like horror, I guess, because the Flesh Hunters are a combination of, I guess, like vampires and werewolves. So the plot I found for this book to be a lot more accessible, and it was a bit of a page turner. I really wanted to find out what happened. Essentially, there are all of these murders that have been happening, and they've been happening by hunters. And hunters are these creatures that Jocelyn Soares has invented for her book, and she has a little definition at the beginning. A hunter is an individual exhibiting neuropsychological symptoms of delusion, psychosis, and aggression, accompanied by episodes of physiologically driven cannibalism and serial violence. Origin unknown. So these are creatures that already exist in this world. They're not being discovered. They've been around. They have been the culprits of murders, and you kind of get the sense that they're humans, but there's something wrong with them, or there's something off. And so that's why they are able to transform into these monsters that are very bloodthirsty and murderous. Essentially, this plot, you're following a forensic psychologist named Walter Carino, and he's been called out of retirement because he did have a traumatic event happen to him to try and find a particular murderer who has emerged and who they think is a hunter. And he is supposed to be an expert on this particular type of creature, slash monster. I thought the mystery was pretty good in here. Like, I tried to figure out who the murderer was, and by halfway through the book, you can figure it out. I did think there were some cool elements about what it means to be profiled as a murderer or a human or a creature that has the capacity to kill. Because there is kind of a scene in here where they're taking blood samples, and there's this study where they're trying to trace, which humans will become hunters, and whether it's something that's innate, like in your genetic sequence, or is it something from nurture. I feel like the writing in the book, it's nothing fancy, but it does keep the pace up. I feel like it's well plotted, and when the murderer was revealed, I did think it was very satisfying. The cliffhanger of the book, I was a little bit confused by. I don't know if we're supposed to be waiting for a sequel, but there's a professor who kind of has more to him than meets the eye, and as well as Amy Nishima, who is Walter's not protege, but she's currently working the case and someone who is supporting Walter as they try and figure out who the murderer is. So there's some relationships that I think were very intriguing, but I'm not really sure if I missed how they were resolved or if they just weren't resolved. So if anyone's read this, I would love to know what you think. We read this for my book club, but because of scheduling, we actually never met up to discuss it. So I am really curious what other people thought about the ending to this book. So for this, I gave this a 3 stars on Goodreads. I think that was mostly driven by the mystery. I think this book is proof that you don't really have to do a ton when it comes to fleshing out the world. You just have to have a very strong voice about what are the elements of that world you're building. You know what I mean? It doesn't have to be a ton of detail. You just have to have evidence that you've thought about it a lot and you kind of know what components are coming together to build your story. So I do think that is something that Sarah has accomplished in this book. So between the two, I do think Flesh Hunters is a more satisfying read, and the elements of the dystopian world in this book were a little bit more up my alley. I think the way Jocelyn Soares tries to use her imagined world to reflect parts of our reality today were pretty effective. I liked the idea of this creature and how they're treated by society and how everyone assumes that they can only be killers, and that idea of, creatures or monsters as a metaphor for outsiders. And then for Surrogate Protocol, it was not an unenjoyable read, but it did kind of drag, and I do feel like there could have been more to the plot or to the reveals that would have made it more satisfying. So if anyone has read either of these, let me know what you think. These are 2 books that are more in the sci-fi mystery genre by Singaporean authors that I've read recently, and the cats are happy that you joined this video. So until the next one, thank you so much for watching.